That young man ran around the base right after the incident saying, I did this, I saw that. He got snagged and hauled in by the OSI, and he got subjected to something that Jim and John or whoever may have been subjected to. And he's told me he was hauled in. He's told me he's been hypnotized there. He's told me he was pumped with sodium pentothal. And I think they used him as a dupe for disinformation. I'm firmly convinced of that. And he and I have had this conversation a half a dozen times. But he still persists, and he's made a career out of this. But so be it. You just need to hear that. Also, Sally Real, who I knew in earlier years, a feature writer for Omni magazine, and wrote the book, The Hard Days, Nights of the Beatles, did a little investigating. This individual claimed he was a backup guitar player for the Beatles. Well, she knew everybody was anybody with the Beatles, so she did some checking. And the answer was he was a groupie that hung around the backstage door. Oh well.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. What you've heard is one lie after another, and there's no nice way to say it, beginning with a young man. Larry is 50, and he appreciated the compliment, but that was not true. Number two, Charles alleges that Larry ran around the base and for some reason wanted to, make a career out of this stuff, and we can kill this right now. His allegation that he says that he was pumped full of sodium pentothal is absolutely a lie. His allegation that Larry Fawcett and he were writing a book is not true. That was never happening. His allegation that Sally Rail, and who was Sally Rail? She was a feature writer for Omni magazine who had approached Larry to write a book. Obviously, as far as I'm concerned, was disappointed because we were already working on one. Approached Peniston to write a book, which I know because of an email that Georgina sent me, and approached Hall to write a book on Rendlesham, which obviously didn't happen as well. And Hall has the audacity to suggest that Sally Rail's saying that Larry said that he was a backup guitarist for the Beatles has any merit at all, and that he hung around backstage. Well, Larry was born in 1961 and the Beatles broke up in 1970. And for a 9-year-old to book a flight to London or whatever is pretty good. Also, I mean, it'd be funny if it wasn't so insulting. And speak about insulting, that he says he saw little green men. Shame on you, Mr. Hall. That is one of the most condescending cliches of anybody who has ever faced off with other intelligences. He knows that Williams wasn't there because the senior officer on a base would always have to be available. Now, if he is to say that Williams, as the wing commander of the base, was the senior officer, and other Air Force personnel agree, I have to defer to that. But he was not the senior officer on the base commander. Conrad was the senior officer. When Williams finally allowed himself to meet with a UFO researcher after years of being more protected than anybody on this subject. And he very quickly, after he was rotated off the base, several months after the event, went out to a base in the United States, very quickly climbed the ranks and left the service as a 2-star general, then went into the aerospace industry out in California. For whatever reason, Williams decided he would speak to Georgina, and he showed up at her apartment in Kensington in London. I don't know, maybe he was bored, maybe he was curious, maybe he was just wanting to be a bit provocative. He gave her as a gift something she showed me, which was an RAF Bentwaters ball hat, and on the back he had personally had embroidered the dates of the event. And when Georgina looked him in the eye and she said, "Were you there?" He responded, quote unquote, "I will neither deny nor confirm my involvement in the incident," which I find very interesting because he could have easily said, "No, I wasn't, but gee, it sounds so interesting, I'd love to have been part of it," or, reacted in another way. But he specifically made a point of saying it that way. The fact that Halt says Jim and John and him are convinced after I heard them say 10 weeks before that they were convinced that Halt was the problem, and they acknowledged Larry for his contributions. Something is wrong here, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how do I get back to the slide?
Down at the bottom.
Hmm?
The bottom of the screen.
Way at the bottom.
Ah, thank you. Oh. Okay. Okay. This is a headline about Halt in a British newspaper here. This is some of the fun that was poked at the case. This is Georgina's business card when she worked for me, and Georgina never told me anything that was untrue. I'm convinced of that. This is her inscription in my copy of her book, You Can't Tell the People. Who knows this case so well? These are two articles about Charles Halt in British papers bringing attention to him. The one that had the headline, UFO Colonel, I seem to have misplaced, but it exists. This is a readout from a polygraph test that Larry and I submitted to with a man named Joe Montaldo, who has a radio show called UFO Undercover. Some of you may be familiar with it. This is specifically a polygraph readout relative to our truth in the UFO incident we had in Suffolk in 1988. And every aspect of that hour-and-a-half tape came up the truth. We did a 2-hour show with Joe before the conference in June that John and Jim decided not to participate in. And Joe asked if he could voice stress that test. Joe made it clear that he had doubts about Jim Peniston's theory. And he did, I think, make a strategic error. It's just me. Joe's a talker. He's a character. He's a good man. He's done hundreds of polygraph tests. And his reputation would be killed if he fabricated one. But he had one guest on the show, which was a guy who worked with him, who also expressed doubts. He invited John on the show. They refused to do it. He said, I have gone over shows that they have done and run polygraphs on those tapes, and you can do a perfectly accurate polygraph. I'm sorry, voice stress analysis from a first-generation audio tape. And there are problems in terms of the truthfulness of aspects of what they are saying. Another one. And I've given a hard copy of this to Stacy, which you are free to disseminate, and for any of you investigators out there who would like to maybe take advantage of VSA technology with a witness to an event or an abductee or an alleged person, you should contact Joe Montaldo. He's on Facebook. You can find him on my Facebook page. Okay. This is the logging road past the east gate of RAF Road where the men made their left and kind of went off into the twilight zone that night. And for me, from the time that many of us first learned about Jim Peniston's time travel theory, here in this room, not this room, that's Larry and me, on the exact 30th anniversary of his incident. By the way, I'm 15 years older than Larry, and he looks 15 years older than me. Some of the soil from our analysis from an extraordinary, I feel the very best evidence that I don't think I'm going to have time to go into today. That's me and Larry at a conference in Liverpool in 2008. This is a letter from Georgina Bruni's mother to me, thanking me for the condolence letter on the passing of her daughter. I put this stuff in because I want you to know I didn't know Georgina casually. I didn't just contribute to her book like John and Jim. We were real friends and good friends. This is the main gate of RAF Bentwaters as it looked, I guess, about 93 or so. This is Georgina's book, You Can't Tell the People. And let me continue on from here. Jim Peniston alleges that he knows for a fact that the presence behind the Rendlesham Forest incident was, quote-unquote, time travelers from our future. One thing that has consistently bothered me is that he has never once taken on the public role of devil's advocate and questioned it, not in any way, shape, or manner. Doing so might well have taken the bottom out of some of the arguments against its likelihood and tended to strengthen his perceived sense of objectivity. Personally, I almost always find myself going on the defensive when somebody says that they have the definitive answer to the kinds of mysteries we face in this work. How can anyone be 100% certain of the credibility of an information source, especially when it's represented by a perceived download of information into one's head? And how trusting of it would we have to be to conclude that there is no chance that Jim may have been used, lied to, or otherwise deceived by it? I cannot help but feel that John Burroughs, his antagonism toward Larry and I notwithstanding, ultimately came to feel trapped some time back and felt he had to throw in his lot with Peniston because the two were out in the forest together and he wanted to remain loyal to his friend. And I admire that. And it really makes me very sad because I like John and I feel very sorry for Jim. I think he is the loudest on this, and I think he is the most fragile on a certain level. But they went through something together that none of us, forget about can imagine, really want to imagine. And that fuses a kind of loyalty that very few of us know about in life. Now, from my way of thinking, the men who went through this and had their own separate little nightmares in this should have come out like a band of brothers and been close. But they have consistently, these three key witnesses, been driven against each other by one particular individual. And that really is what this talk comes down to. Charles Hall has made it his business to influence the thinking, attitudes, and behavior of Jim and John toward Larry Warren, his involvement in the events of 1280 and the Count of Same. While such actions may be motivated by personal reasons, and he has every right to still be angry at Larry in a human way, I feel, I don't know, I feel it is more likely that he is being influenced or pressured to do so as part of an overall, ongoing effort to discredit, undermine, and downplay the specifics of Larry's account and their implications. When all is said and done, what are we really up against here? For me, it comes down to an ongoing effort by specific individuals and agencies to keep the truth about Rendlesham and other related events from we the people. This is a highly sophisticated group with access to the best and brightest people, unlimited amounts of money and power, media, and most advanced scientific tools available to humanity. There is plenty of actual court-worthy evidence established that Rendlesham is, at least in part, a truly anomalous event of the first order. But, and again, Stacey, you back in here?
I'm here.
I want, about how much time do I have before Q&A?
How about 10 more minutes of talk?
Okay, then I'm not going to get to present that other stuff, but I'm glad I'm having the chance to do this. There is plenty of evidence, etc. But if we can be associated with enough, if it can be associated with enough baggage that the public and media will deem far-fetched and silly, then right or wrong, it will come to be categorized as just another UFO tale and relegated to the trash bin of history, and you can count on it. This understood. What if at least part of the Rendlesham Forest incident was an extremely well-planned and long-term, highly sophisticated intelligence operation designed by decidedly terrestrial intelligences to anticipate and discredit a truly anomalous UFO event or other paranormal event within a military complex, a military context, by implanting a belief in a subject that the event in question originated with time travelers from our future, an explanation which might be eaten alive by a skeptical media and skeptical public. A wild possibility? Of course. Very likely? Not necessarily. But more likely than actual time travelers from our future? Yes, I think so. One thing that has always bothered me about Jim's insistence on time traveler thesis, and I'm repeating myself here as tired at the end, I've always approached the paranormal investigations that I do from a deductive reasoning point of view. I begin with the most mundane, examine them from every angle possible. If that does not explain the event, I go on to the next most mundane. And when I'm done, if what I'm left with is still a mystery, then I begin to investigate it as something truly extraordinary and paranormal. It's boring, It's repetitive, it's not very sexy, it's not very romantic, but it's the way that I work. If you are on Facebook and would like to follow or participate in on what I feel is the best informed dialogue on Rendlesham available today anywhere, join us at the Rendlesham Forrest Lone Ranger UFO sighting site. And thank you all so much for your patience in hearing me out today. Questions?
How many witnesses to the incident? All the witnesses
How many witnesses?
to the incident?
A lot.
And where are they and how are they doing?
Well, number one, the great majority of them have never come forward, nor would I have. Of the ones that have come forward at different times, they're doing different ways to the best of my knowledge, and I don't really know because they don't keep in touch with me. But remember, we're dealing with 3 nights, each night of which had a series of different events go on, including landings in the woods, beams shot down to the ground, men confronting women, confronting different phenomena. One female personnel who was out there on one of the nights in question, sitting in the cab of a pickup truck, had something of a breakdown when a light flew into a pickup truck and started to move around. So I'm not in a position to answer that question. I wish I was.
I have
Hi.
a question. Hi. I had heard that Larry had ended up with flash burns, damaged retina.
Yes.
How did they explain that?
Well, they didn't. Again, if I had twice the time I have, I would have given you some extraordinary physical evidence. When the thing that Larry saw, which was a fully articulated machine that appeared in the field in a ground fog that was self-illuminated, appeared. Should I keep talking? You want me to move? Maybe it's where I'm sitting?
It might have to come out a little bit.
Yeah. When it appeared in the field, it appeared with a blinding flash of light, as you know, Kyle, because you're familiar with the case. And it was described to me as like a wall of old-fashioned flash bulbs that just went off, and Larry felt temporarily blinded. He averted his eyes, but you can't avert it after it happens. It took several seconds for vision to return, and then there was the machine sitting there. Immediately, his eyes began to bother him. Within a day, he had reported to the base medical office that he wanted an eye exam. Being the military, it happened, even though it was reported shortly after the December 28th date. The exam came on February 2nd, 1981, at the Lakenheath, RAF Lakenheath Eye and Ear Clinic, which was the specialty clinic. And at that examination, we have that piece of physical evidence, Air Force Form 490, where the physician writes the following: opti/ret burn EXP, optical retinal burn exposure. The retinas of his eyes were burned. Now, it didn't blind him. He can see, he wears glasses, but if he had had optical retinal burns from God knows what, it would have been picked up in his Air Force physical in 1980. It wasn't. That is one piece of physical evidence that we offer. But there's never been a reaction to it officially. Sir?
I heard about these, the lights from these vehicles or UFOs or whatever they were, beaming onto atomic weapons that are buried underground. What is, I mean, I haven't read all this stuff, but what is supposed to be the effect of light from these vehicles or ships on nuclear warheads?
Mm-hmm. What is the effect of these beams of light on nuclear ordnance? I can't give you a technical answer, but what I can tell you is Bob Salas, who some of you have heard speak, a former captain in the United States Air Force, who in 1967 was a missile control officer in charge of, I don't know, 6, 8 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Maelstrom Air Force Base, thanks, yeah. Was down there watching his board as UFOs came in over. He's listening to the chatter, and his missiles are shutting down. Charles Halt told Larry and I and Bob Exler that the beams of light adversely affected the ordnance. We can only interpret that phrase. One thing it didn't do was blow them up.
Right.
But it made them, I guess we can deduce, inoperable.
What I was curious about is if there was any kind of an idea that the beams of light had an effect on the radioactive warhead. For example, I don't mean detonate, I mean
Yeah, of course.
eliminate some of the half-life of the U-235 or whatever.
I can only make an educated guess on that. My speculation would be no different than yours. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Does Larry deny that he was subjected to hypnotism and brainwashing?
Oh, never, no. What happened with Larry?
So the difference is that the Holt's version of how he was hypnotized and his version differ.
Well, first, hypnosis doesn't enter into it. Larry was hypnotized by Bud Hopkins many years after the fact, and the transcript of that hypnosis appears in Left at East Gate.
I mean at the base.
Yeah, hypnosis, to the best of our knowledge, doesn't enter into it at all. What happened with Larry was the event happens on the night. The next morning, he breaks security. He disobeys a law, he disobeys an order, and he goes to a base telephone, and he telephones his mother, who he's very close to, who lives in upstate New York, and he starts to tell her about the event, and the call is cut off. Greg Batcham, another airman security cop who was with Larry that night, is standing there. And Larry gets angry, calls an operator, says, I was just cut off on a transatlantic call. Her response is, sir, were you calling from within the base? He says, yes. She says, oh, sir, if you were cut off, it was from within the base. He looks at Greg and says, I'm, and then an Anglo-Saxon word for people having sex, and goes back to his billet and waits for somebody to call or pick him up. He is informed he has to go see, I think, Major Ziegler in the law enforcement area. Ziegler says things to the effect of, look, I know there's a lot of pressure and upset about what you saw last night. I'm characterizing here, it's in the book, the exact words, but you were ordered not to speak about this, and you have. And Larry looked at him and lied and said, no, I didn't, sir. And he said, yes, you did. He opens a drawer of his desk. There's a reel-to-reel tape recorder. He pushes a button, and he plays that brief call. He says, listen, I'm not going to throw the book at you. You guys have been through it. I either have to take your stripes or fine you. The fine would be increments taken monthly, and Larry said if I lost my stripes, I don't think I was ever going to get them back, so I took the fine, which I think was $300. And when he left the service, and I'll get back to the second half of your question in a second, because this is important, he was still owing like $90 to $96 and change. 5 years later, 1985, 86 as I recall, he receives a letter from the Office of Air Force Finance somewhere in Colorado. Dear Mr. Warren, it's come to our attention that when you left the service, you left owing $90 and some cents. You will please repay this by check at your earliest convenience, or we will turn this matter over to the Internal Revenue Service. Larry, who at his best is absolutely amazing, writes them back and says, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot. Of course I'll get that check out to you. Could you please remind me what it's in reference to? He never heard back. I guess he still owes him the money. Glenn, what was the second half of your question?
No, what Holt said was that he was subjected.
Oh, all right. What was Larry's? How was he taken down? Okay. Later, after his debriefing that afternoon with other men involved, he is called and told to be outside of his dormitory. They didn't have barracks then. Dormitory at 8 o'clock that night for a continued debriefing with some guys. Not happy about it, but he's there at 8. And his conscious memories here were in and out. And it wasn't until about 93 that he called me and said, I've got to know. Can you talk to Bud about doing a regression with me? And he came in the next weekend. Bud did it. The transcript is in the book, except for one very provocative sentence at the end, which I may release the information on that very shortly. I'm still thinking about it. But he walks out, and a late model black vehicle, American car, pulls up with New York State plates. Not that uncommon for people to have New York plates, I mean American plates on foreign bases. They have the car shipped, whatever. And it's two guys in suits. The guy gets out of the driver's seat. Are you Warren? Yeah. He says, let me see some ID. Larry's nervous. He's Larry. He says, let me see some ID, to which the guy does not react well. At that point, he realizes the other guy coming around this way, and he looks up as the guy raises what we now know, because he relived it in this hypnosis. And I have witnessed more hypnotic regressions than I can remember with Bud. Bud took a full half hour to put him under. And the only Larry I had ever known until that moment was a tough, armored, no-nonsense, courageous, angry person. And in the 25 years that I have really known him, that's still the only hour that I met a frightened 19-year-old kid. He was under. I bet my life on it. And what all of the clarity, there's no ambiguity. The guy who comes around from the driver's seat raises his arm. He has an aerosol can with no label, and he sprays Larry in the face, and Larry goes down. He's having trouble breathing, can't control his motor functions, his nose is running, he can't see. He feels himself being thrown into the back seat of the car moves, he's taken out, he's brought into a building, he's put in an elevator, the elevator starts to move, he's taken out, and then he's missing from upstairs for a day or so. Now, when he told me this, and I'm putting together in my mind, my God, what is real? What isn't real? What do you remember? I rely, in part as an investigator, on tiny, all too human details. It doesn't matter. Sometimes all the paperwork and the physical evidence in the world, the thing that pushes it over the edge is a tiny detail. He remembered his ears popping. Now, I've spoken to a number of medical and mental health professionals over the decades. And I want to tell you this also. For 8 of the 9 years I worked on the book, I worked very quietly at a volunteer job in New York City for a British organization called Samaritans International, hardly known in this country, a brilliant organization that is of service to people in over 40 countries. I think it's over 60 years old now. They run walk-in centers, counseling centers, and crisis hotlines. For 8 years, once a week, for 3 times a month, 1 time a month all night with some very necessary breaks, I worked on the busiest suicide hotline in America. I didn't do it because I'm altruistic and, some, noble soul. I did it because I needed to, and because I was brought up to be of service. And because it was the one thing that I was doing that got me to take my mind off of what had happened to my life and to Larry and to all the crap I had gotten myself into. I bring it up because it put me in contact with quite a number of mental health professionals who I took advantage of with this question. The question was, in terms of inducing an hallucination, can you induce an auditory tactile hallucination? Can you make somebody know, in quotes, that there's a physiological thing happening where their ears pop? We all experience it going up in planes or what have you. And they said, every one of them over the years has said, to the best of my knowledge, no. That is one of the reasons why I am convinced, even though it sounds so wild at first, a secret underground facility under the base. Secret underground facilities are so common in the military all over the world now. It's a joke that people actually think that it sounds kind of wild. A month ago, I gave a series of talks in France before I went to England to speak at this conference. And I returned to England in a way I never have before. In the past, I've taken the boat from Calais to Dover and then made my way to where I need to go. This time, I took the tunnel under the English Channel. There's a tunnel under the English Channel. It's over 20 miles long. This was done like 30 years ago with civilian technology. Who the hell knows what we're doing really? And we all know there's stuff going on under our feet here. But never, ever, ever underestimate. It's mind-blowing. But again, Larry was chemically subdued then and there. And then he has this very clear series of memories, some of which may be induced, some of which are very real. But it was 24 hours, 30 hours or more before he was released. New Year's Eve day, I think, and got particularly drunk that night. And left the service with an honorable discharge in May of the following year. Questions?
Oh, I just want to ask you, so Hall knew that? Hall knew that he had been subjected to something. He said so in the video just now.
Oh, yes. Oh,
How
yes.
did he know that?
He's a deputy base commander. He also now acknowledges very fully that Jim and John have been through it and alludes to the fact that other men may well have. But for many years, it was only Larry. You can't trust him because he's been meddled with. Now we know from John's incredible communication to Halt and to Hazeltine that he was doing the same goddamn thing to John. And that now, when questioned about it, he puts, that I heard last, they were all kind of, you know, guys who had been messed with and things, although now they're all back together again, John and Jim and Halt. John and Jim will be here in October, and I hope you all will be here too, and treat them with respect. I have not had a good time this afternoon on a certain level, and at the same time, I am so thankful I have an opportunity to lay this out for you, because I've been living with it for years, and it's only lately that I've felt this is important for me to do. Not for me to feel better, but for you to know and for the truth to come out, for this dialogue to continue with respect to these players. Question. Antonio.
Yeah, hi, Pete. As you know, there have been some releases on the MOD.
Yes.
About dead waters.
Yeah.
And on the previous one, not the one that they just releasing now, there was a lot of stuff about Lord Hill Norton.
Yeah.
And I wrote an article in the Open Minds magazine and also in the website about the profile of him because of his employment. You know, he was a very, I never met him personally, but he was an admiral of the fleet. And he, at one time, he was
Chief of the
NATO,
Joint Chiefs of the
military
MOD, and then a member of Parliament.
Right. So he was tremendously gung-ho, as you know, on the Rendlesham case, and kept pestering the MOD,
Yes.
Ministry of Defense, for years.
Yes.
And he would not take a no for an answer.
No, he wouldn't.
And especially, he objected to that there was no defense significance. And some of the correspondence at the
Yes.
release was amazing. The way he treated some of the people at the House of
Oh,
Lords.
man.
He wasn't too diplomatic. But anyway, and by the way, your book is mentioned there too, in the questions that he read periodically.
I haven't gotten to that yet. I'm glad to hear that.
There's like 300 pages.
I have to go over that the next couple of days with you.
And basically, he kept putting these questions in the chamber of the House of Lords
Yes.
to the MOD, and he used your book and also Georgina, of course, he was
Yes.
a consultant for
Sure.
Georgina. And one of the questions, I wonder whether you have any additional information on this. He mentions, I think it was a juvenile detention center somewhere in that area. I forgot the name of it, but it's in my article, and it's of course in the documents, where supposedly the records for those crucial days were missing. Do you know anything about that?
I know nothing about it, but I'd like to take a moment to expand on what you've said. Antonio, who some of you know, Antonio Huneas, one of our really best people in this field, bar none, and a dear friend and soul brother. We started out in this together 35 years ago, who works for the wonderful organization Open Minds that gives us a terrific magazine. Now the UFO Congress, a wonderful website, television, radio, they're an awesome organization. Antonio is referring to release of new documents on Rendlesham that references a gentleman, a titled Englishman, named Admiral Lord Peter Hill Norton, who passed about, 10 years ago at 92 years old, as I recall. Hill Norton was Admiral of the Fleet, meaning the highest ranking British military naval officer at that time. He went on to become the equivalent of the Chief of Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Ministry of Defense. When he left there, he became a member of Parliament. And when he learned through Larry and I, and you didn't get to Hill Norton in ufology unless Timothy Good cut the introduction. Tim was the only person in the field he had total respect and admiration for. Tim cut the introduction. Larry and I conversed with him a number of times. I corresponded with him. He wrote a wonderful letter that I include as part of this. But imagine, with his rank, he was not privy to the nuclear treaty violation. And when he learned of that, and whatever it was of no defense significance, he went ballistic. And that man was a thorn in the side of Her Majesty's government from then till the day that he died. Let me tell you something else that I'm very proud of. On October 28th, 1997, some months after Left at East came out, he, as a member of Parliament, went out onto the floor of Parliament, House of Lords, with the hardcover copy of his book in hand, read the book into the equivalent of the Parliamentary Daily Record, went up to the Secretary for Defense and asked him for very hard and very, very uncomfortable questions drawn from the book, each question of which